You read somewhere that New Zealand is one of the best countries in the world to live in. Top 10 for quality of life. Clean and green. Safe. Peaceful. And then you walked into Pak'nSave on a Tuesday evening and spent $320 on a trolley that 2 years ago would have cost you $200. You filled up the car at $3.20 a litre. You paid $650 a week for a flat in Auckland that had mold in the bathroom and a landlord who took 3 weeks to fix the hot water. And you sat there, looking at your bank balance, trying to work out where this world-class quality of life was supposed to be hiding. Maybe you've had this conversation. You're sitting with mates. Someone mentions their cousin moved to Melbourne. Same job, 20% more pay. And rent? That's actually lower. And someone else says, yeah, but New Zealand's better, it's safer, the lifestyle's better, and everyone nods. But nobody can explain why a country that's supposedly better still leaves you with almost nothing at the end of the fortnight. You earn $65,000 a year, which sounds decent until you subtract rent, groceries, petrol, power, and your student loan repayment. And you're left wondering what you're actually doing wrong. Here's the thing. You're not doing anything wrong. You just never got told how the New Zealand economy actually works. Not the version they give you on the news with GDP numbers and trade balances. The version that explains why you feel the way you feel when you look at your bank account. By the end of this video, you'll understand the New Zealand economy the way it really operates. Not as a collection of statistics, as a machine with parts you can see and touch. You'll know where the money comes from, why everything costs what it costs, and why that gap between what you earn and what you spend isn't an accident. It's a feature of the system you live in. Everything about the New Zealand economy comes from two questions. Why does a country that does so many things right still feel so expensive? And what actually drives this economy in the first place? Those two questions have names. The first is about the engines. The second is about the isolation cost. And once you see how they connect, you won't look at a grocery receipt the same way again. Before we can answer either question, you need to see what it means to be New Zealand in the global economy. Because the thing that defines everything, the thing that shapes your salary, your rent, your grocery bill, and your chances of ever owning a home is something so obvious most Kiwis never think about it. New Zealand is 5.2 million people sitting at the bottom of the South Pacific, roughly 3 hours by plane from the nearest major economy, which is Australia, and which has 5 times the population. The next nearest major trading partner is China, and that's 11 hours away. The United States is 13. Europe is a full day in the air. Everything that isn't made here has to travel a very, very long way to get here. And everything that is made here has to travel a very, very long way to reach anyone who wants to buy it. That's not just a geographical fact. It's the single most important economic fact about New Zealand. The country is like an artisan cafe at the end of a long rural road. It produces incredible things. Dairy that's world-class. Landscapes that people fly across the planet to see. Wine that wins international awards. But the cost of getting anything to and from that cafe is enormous. And that cost shows up in the price of everything. This is what economists call a small, open economy. Small, because 5 million people can't sustain a massive domestic market. Open, because New Zealand has to trade with the world to survive. It exports what it's good at making, and imports almost everything else. And here's the catch. New Zealand depends on the world far more than the world depends on New Zealand. When China wants our milk powder, life is good. When China doesn't, things get tight very quickly. That asymmetry, that imbalance, defines everything. Your salary, your rent, the price of eggs, the value of the Kiwi dollar. All of it flows from the fact that we're small, we're far away, and we need the world more than it needs us. Now that you have that foundation, the two tools make sense. Let's start with the engines. The New Zealand economy runs on 3 main engines. Think of them as 3 legs of a stool. If one wobbles, the whole thing tilts. If two wobble at the same time, you feel it immediately. And in the last few years, all three have wobbled at once, which is why things have felt the way they have. The first engine is the primary sector: agriculture, dairy, forestry, fishing, horticulture. This is the oldest engine and still the most powerful. New Zealand is, at its core, a farm that happens to be a country. Dairy alone makes up more than a quarter of all export earnings. Fonterra, the dairy cooperative, is one of the largest dairy exporters on the planet. When the global price of whole milk powder goes up, billions of dollars flow into New Zealand. Farmers earn more. Rural towns do better. The Kiwi dollar strengthens because foreign buyers need New Zealand dollars to pay for New Zealand milk. And when the price drops, the whole chain reverses. Farmers cut costs. Small towns struggle. The dollar weakens. This matters because it means your economic well-being is tied to something most Kiwis never think about. The price of milk powder in Shanghai affects whether your employer can afford to give you a pay rise this year. That sounds like an exaggeration. It isn't. New Zealand's economy is so dependent on primary exports that a bad season for dairy can shift the entire national mood. It's the engine that keeps the lights on. And it's powered by grass, rain, and what happens on the other side of the world. The second engine is tourism. Before COVID, tourism was the country's biggest single export earner. More than dairy, more than anything else. People flew from Europe, from Asia, from North America to see the mountains and the lakes and the coastline. They spent money on accommodation, food, transport, and experiences. That money created jobs in every corner of the country. Small towns that had nothing else had tourism. Then the borders closed. And overnight,
that engine stopped completely. Hotels emptied. Tour operators went under. Whole communities lost their income in a matter of weeks. What COVID showed, more clearly than anything else could have, is how fragile an engine tourism is. It brings in enormous amounts of money, but it can vanish in an instant. It depends on things completely outside New Zealand's control. A pandemic, an airline route being cancelled.
A recession in a country 10,000 kilometers away that means fewer people can afford the trip. Tourism is powerful, but it's unpredictable, and any economy that relies on it too heavily is building on sand. The third engine is housing and construction. This one's complicated because it's the engine that most directly affects your daily life. When houses are being built, construction companies hire, suppliers sell materials, architects and surveyors and lawyers all get work. The construction sector employs a huge number of Kiwis. And when house prices rise, homeowners feel wealthier. They spend more. And that spending feeds into the rest of the economy. Banks lend more because the collateral, the houses, is worth more. It becomes a cycle that feeds itself. The key point is this. These three engines don't operate in isolation. Dairy earns the foreign currency. Tourism brings in the visitors. Housing keeps the domestic economy ticking. Together, they're why New Zealand functions. But each one carries a vulnerability. Dairy depends on global commodity prices. Tourism depends on the world wanting to come here. Housing depends on people being able to afford to buy, which depends on interest rates, which depend on the RBNZ, which responds to inflation, which is driven partly by the other two engines. They're all connected. And that's about to matter a lot. Now let's look at the second question. If these engines are generating wealth, why does everything still cost so much? The first reason is geographic isolation. This is the one that hides in plain sight. New Zealand is far from everywhere. That means every imported product, from electronics to clothing to fuel to building materials, has to travel thousands of kilometers by sea or air to reach you. Shipping costs money, lots of money, and that cost is baked into the retail price of almost everything you buy. When you pick up a pair of shoes at a shop in Wellington, part of what you're paying is the cost of getting those shoes from a factory in Vietnam to a port in Tauranga, to a warehouse, to the shelf. In a country like Germany, that supply chain is short and cheap. In New Zealand, it's long and expensive. And there is nothing anyone can do about the distance. No policy, no government, no innovation can move New Zealand closer to its trading partners. This isolation also works in the other direction. New Zealand exporters have to ship their products a long way to reach buyers. That makes exports more expensive, which makes New Zealand products less competitive on price, which means they have to compete on quality instead. It's why New Zealand dairy is premium, why New Zealand wine aims for the top shelf, why tourism sells the experience, not the bargain. The country can't win on price. It has to win on quality. And that strategy works, but it keeps the cost of everything at home stubbornly high. The second reason is lack of scale. 5 million people is a very small market. Think about what that means for competition. In the United States, if a supermarket chain charges too much, another chain opens across the road and undercuts them. There are dozens of options. In New Zealand, groceries are dominated by two major groups. Foodstuffs, which owns Pak'nSave and New World, and Woolworths New Zealand, which runs Countdown. 2. That's not a market. That's a duopoly. And duopolies don't compete on price the way larger markets do. The Commerce Commission has investigated this and found that New Zealanders pay significantly more for groceries than people in comparable countries. The same lack of scale shows up everywhere. Fewer airlines means more expensive flights. Fewer building suppliers means more expensive construction. Fewer internet providers means the plans cost more. When you only have 5 million potential customers, businesses can't spread their fixed costs as thinly. The maths is simple. If it costs $10 million to set up a factory and you can sell to 330 million Americans, the cost per unit is tiny. If you can only sell to 5 million Kiwis, the cost per unit is enormous. That difference shows up in the price of nearly everything. The third reason is the wage price loop. This one's the most invisible and the most powerful. Because the cost of living is high in New Zealand, wages need to be high enough for people to survive. But when wages go up, businesses pass that cost on through higher prices, which makes the cost of living go up, which means wages need to go up again. It's a cycle that feeds itself, slowly, constantly, and it's incredibly difficult to break without causing pain somewhere. The RBNZ tries to manage this through the official cash rate, raising it to cool things down and lowering it to stimulate activity. But the loop is always there, turning quietly in the background, keeping New Zealand expensive. Here's the part most people never see. These two things, the engines and the isolation cost, they look like separate topics. One is about what makes the economy run. The other is about why things cost so much. But they're not separate. They're the same thing. Dairy exports sustain the economy, but dairy is the reason New Zealand's land is so valuable, which drives up the price of housing, which drives up the cost of living. Tourism brings in money, but tourists compete with locals for accommodation, for rental cars, for restaurant tables, for housing in small towns. Housing keeps the domestic economy alive, but the higher house prices go, the less affordable life becomes for anyone who doesn't already own one. The engines that power the economy are the same forces that make it expensive. The economy that gives you your job is the economy that charges you too much for groceries. It's not two separate problems. It's one system, pulling in two directions at once. The same rain that fills the rivers also causes the floods. The same dairy industry that makes New Zealand rich on paper is the reason a block of cheese costs $12 at the supermarket. Imagine a treadmill that powers the lights in your house. The faster you run, the brighter the lights. But the faster you run, the more energy you burn, the more food you need, and the food is expensive because the treadmill is powering the shop that sells it. You can't get off. You can't slow down. You just run. And the system runs with you. Once you see this, you can't unsee it. Every time someone says New Zealand is too expensive, the answer is yes, and it's expensive because of the same things that make it work. That's not a comfortable truth, but it's the truth. And once you understand this, you can spot the mistakes almost everyone makes. The first mistake is thinking New Zealand is expensive by accident. It's not. It's expensive by structure. The isolation, the small population, the lack of competition, these are permanent features. They don't change with elections or policies. They're baked into the geography. Waiting for things to get cheaper without understanding why they're expensive in the first place is like waiting for the tide to stop coming in. The second mistake is ignoring how dependent the economy is on dairy. Heaps of Kiwis have no idea that a price drop in whole milk powder in China can ripple through the entire economy within months. Fonterra's payout to farmers affects rural spending, affects small-town businesses, affects employment, affects government tax revenue. When someone on the One News says dairy prices are down, that's not a farming story. That's a story about your job security. The third mistake is thinking the brain drain to Australia is just about wages. It's not. It's about the total equation. An Australian salary might be 20% higher, but that's only part of it. Housing in many Australian cities is more affordable relative to income. Groceries cost less. Petrol costs less. The gap isn't just in what you earn, it's in what you keep after you've paid for everything. Understanding the isolation cost explains why so many Kiwis look across the Tasman and wonder if the grass really is greener. Sometimes the maths says it is. Let me show you exactly how this knowledge is useful right now. Next time you see a headline about the OCR changing, you'll understand the chain. The RBNZ moves the OCR. Banks adjust their rates. Mortgage holders pay more or less. That changes how much money people have to spend, which changes how much businesses earn, which changes whether they hire or fire, which changes the unemployment rate, which changes how much tax the government collects. One number, set by one institution, ripples through every part of the economy. And now, you can trace the ripple. When you compare your salary with someone in Melbourne or London, you'll know to compare the full picture. Not just the number on the payslip, but what that number actually buys after rent, groceries, transport, and everything else. A $65,000 salary in Auckland and an $80,000 salary in Melbourne might leave you with the same amount at the end of the month, or they might not. But now you know how to check. When someone tells you property prices will come down eventually, you'll understand why that's unlikely in any dramatic way. The supply of land is constrained. Building costs are high because materials are imported. Demand continues because the population is growing. The same engines that make the economy work make housing expensive. It's structural, not cyclical. And when you feel that frustration, that gap between what the rankings say about New Zealand and what your bank account says, you'll understand that both things are true at the same time. New Zealand really is a remarkable place to live, and it really is expensive. These aren't contradictions, they're two sides of the same economy. Here's what you now know. The New Zealand economy runs on three engines. Dairy and primary exports earn the foreign currency. Tourism brings in spending from abroad. Housing and construction keep the domestic economy turning. These engines are real. They create jobs, they generate income, and they fund the public services that make this country work. But the same forces that power those engines also make New Zealand one of the most expensive countries in the developed world. Geographic isolation inflates the cost of everything. A small population kills competition and prevents economies of scale. And the wage price loop keeps the whole system locked in a cycle where costs and incomes chase each other upward. The three most practically useful ideas are these. First, the economy is not abstract. It touches your payslip, your grocery bill, and your rent, and now you can see how. Second, New Zealand's high cost of living is not a flaw in the system. It is the system, the direct consequence of being small, far away, and dependent on a few key industries. And third, the economy that employs you is the economy that charges you. They are not two separate problems. They are one. and understanding that single truth is the beginning of making smarter decisions about your money, your career, and your future in Aotearoa. You walked into Pak'nSave and couldn't explain why everything costs so much. Now you can. And more importantly, now you can plan for it instead of just being surprised by it. This is general education, not personalized financial advice. If you need advice for your situation, talk to a licensed financial advisor.